On this week's What the Ship, we update some past stories. The U.S. supply chain woes shift and persist into 2023. The Black Sea grain deal has been extended for 2 months. We take a look at some national maritime stories across the globe. And finally, is there a case for a Maritime G7? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, a lot going on around the world. It's been 2 weeks since we've done What the Ship. Sorry about that. It was the end of the academic year at Campbell University where I teach, so it gets a little crazy and busy trying to get grades in and graduate some seniors. But back in the summer mode now and back doing our weekly What the Ships. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell. This episode in particularly will look at all the news across the maritime spectrum, try to wrap it together, about 30 minutes long, but we look at 5 stories and try to contextualize them and how this impacts you, the global consumer. All right, let's go ahead and jump to story number 1. All right, story number 1 is some updates of some past stories we've done. And we've been running through a chain of maritime issues, disasters, accidents around the globe. So let's go around the world and update you on a few stories. So we've done 2 videos so far on the Mark W. Barker. This is the Great Laker that ran aground off Belle Isle, Detroit. Just did 2 episodes on that. That vessel is still showing to be off of Belle Isle as we speak. She's no longer grounded, but at anchor in the Detroit River, undergoing repairs and investigation by the United States Coast Guard. We expect, based on reports, for the vessel to be underway soon, but not exactly sure about the damage that was done to the vessel and assessing it. That's really the big issue that's going on right now with the Barker. We had this story weeks ago now. This is the story of the OS-35. This is a vessel that got involved in a collision with an LNG carrier coming out of Gibraltar. The vessel was rammed and hit, anchored, and then eventually sunk and broke apart off of Gibraltar. The removal of the wreck has undergone a delay, and according to this report by Mike Schuller, they anticipate that the aft section will be floated out on May 29th, while the forward section will not begin until June 2nd, with an estimated removal time of June 16th. This vessel was involved in an environmental spill due to fuel oil that was on board the ship. So this is one of those hazards we see happening around the world. We talked about the ferry Walla. This is a Washington state ferry that went aground after losing power, and what is suspected here is a generator failure on board the vessel is what led to the vessel grounding itself. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. The ship got underway, was able to get back to the dock. They used one of their fast ferries to come on board and eventually remove the personnel. But again, it's suspected to be a generator failure. And then finally, we talked about this vessel, the Shiling, out of New Zealand, that broke down. This is a vessel that had been plagued by issues. It was actually held in port longer to do some repairs. The ship is still showing to be in Tasman Bay at anchor. A lot of comments on this on the video I posted. One of the things I did find out is that the vessel was suspected to be heading toward Bangladesh to be scrapped, which makes a lot of sense because when you look at that vessel, it didn't have a heavy load on it. It was pretty lightly, almost no deck cargo at all, riding pretty high. And the ship was bound for Singapore. And we're going to come back to New Zealand because in doing this story, I unearthed some other stories about New Zealand that I found really interesting. And one of the reasons I love doing this show is I do find information from people about stories that send me down a rabbit hole. And so everybody in New Zealand, you did that to me. And so I'm going to talk about that in one of our stories coming up. Anyway, that's our updates on past stories. I try to keep you up and abreast of stories that are going on. We cover a lot, and so I hope to use the first story in What the Ship to really recap when there's a lot going on. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 2. Story number 2 deals with the container sector. So I'm going to take you through a myriad of stories here. I'm not going to go a lot of depth in stories, but I want to string them together. And I'll have all these stories in the show notes so you can take a look at them. But one of the things I find really interesting is when you string these stories together, you get a better picture of what's happening. So this Reuters story over in G Captain, U.S. supply chain woes shift and persist in 2023. The U.S. supply chain is healing from early pandemic shocks. Jump ahead, rates for trucking, ocean shipping, and other transportation tumbled after U.S. consumers shifted from spending from big ticket items like furniture, barbecue grills, big screen TVs to travel and other entertainment. We went from buying merchandise to services. However, quote, there's still a big mess out there, said Ryan Patel, senior fellow at Claremont Graduate University's Drucker School of Management. This last section. The labor market remains tight, fueling costs. Elsewhere, machine parts shortages persist, and cement has become difficult to find as automakers and other manufacturers catch up with demand and U.S. ramp up infrastructure projects. All right, what does that mean for global ocean shipping? Well, what we're seeing is a couple of things here. So right off the bat, we had heard that with China reopening, we're going to see a big boom in shipping. But the reality of that is not exactly there. Henry Byers over at FreightWaves, using their system called Sonar, is showing the data that the container surge was way overblown, that we're not seeing this big, huge wave of goods coming out of China. At the same time, when you look at what's happening in ports, I think it's really important to take a look at this. So the Port of Houston is seeing a surge in container exports. This is part of that trend of shifting containers and cargo from the West Coast to the East and Gulf Coast, although be careful about that. This story from Reuters, U.S. West Coast ports regain lost volume as competitive pressure mounts. So one of the things we're seeing is that trend of shift from the West Coast to the East Coast and Gulf Coast kind of reversed itself just a bit in April, with more cargo coming into the West Coast. And that has a lot to do with the depressed freight rates on the West Coast. Because of that really low freight rates coming in from the West Coast, more shippers are willing to start taking chances now. Plus, there's rumors of an agreement coming between the ILWU and the PMA. This is the International Longshore Warehouse Union and the Pacific Maritime Association. So more cargo is more likely to come into the West Coast now, and that's exactly what we're seeing. At the same time, but we're still seeing the Gulf and East Coast take their share. This story by Mike Schuller, G-Captain, deepened Jacksonville Port's new largest ship record with ONE, bringing in the largest ship yet to Florida. And this is all part of that restructuring. The ONE store came in to Jacksport. This vessel has a carrying capacity of over 11,000 TEUs, almost 12,000 TEUs. And what we're seeing is that shift taking place. So kind of a mixed message here, obviously. We're seeing growth on the East and Gulf Coast ports, but at the same time, the West Coast is trying to get traffic back, but they've been hampered by a lot of issues. But if the ILWU and PMA can resolve their issues, then there's a potential for the West Coast to get back a portion of their share. However, ports like Houston, Jacksonville, Savannah, and New York have seen increases, very big increases in the amount of containers they're handling. Goes to this story next. Greg Miller over at FreightWaves, U.S. imports up again in April as market mirrors pre-COVID normal. So when you look at the data coming out of groups like Descartes, they're showing for April, for example, we're seeing this uptick. Since February, we're seeing a rise. Well below the 2021, 2022 numbers up here, but above the 2019 and 2020 numbers. So we're seeing that. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Descartes is talking about is expect to see that growth continue and peaking right around August, which is usually what happens. After August is usually, and if you look at that 4-year average there, that's where you start seeing that off tick take place. It starts to decline, except back in 2020 because of COVID. So actually what we're seeing is pre-COVID levels coming in, and the system is really starting to settle out into where it wants to be. Go into this, we are mirroring what's happening with North American imports with global volume. So if you look at the global volume of containers in million of containers, million TEUs, you see that the North American numbers, which are the access here, are mirroring basically the trend. So you're seeing upticks back in early 2023. This is actually this should be February 2022. This graph is misnumbered. This should be 2022. And then what you're seeing here is the downturn here late in 2022, and then the big huge plummet down in February of 2023, and now the uptick taking place. So a change. And then if you look at the China share of U.S. containerized imports, here you see the dark blue is imports from China, the light blue imports from other countries. The red shows you China percentage of total imports on this axis on the right here. And what you see is how everything declines but then starts to kick back up. A very telling indication here. And this coincides with what we're getting from the container companies, companies like HMM, which was the old Hyundai Merchant Marine. This is the Korean, large Korean carrier. Their revenues have plunged, prompting measures to counter the economic downturns. They're still making profits, don't get me wrong. The company reported a staggering 58% decrease in revenue, plummeting to US $1.5 billion from that period last year. But last year was a record year, so they're still making profits. They're just not making as much profits as they have in the past. And that coincides with companies like MSC, the Mediterranean Shipping Company, and now CMA CGM, which are in this huge shipbuilding race. They are building ships like crazy. And everyone asks themselves, well, wait a minute, Sal, if freight is coming down, ocean freight's coming down, containers are coming down, why are the shipping companies buying vessels? Well, that's because they're flush with cash. And we see this every time. The shipping companies don't buy when, it should. They buy when they have cash in the hand. They can put money down. They can pay cheaper for the vessels now than they can later. So they're buying fleets. We're seeing it with MSC, Mediterranean Shipping, and we're seeing it with CMA CGM. To the point that CMA CGM is about to supplant Maersk as the second largest container company in the world. Maersk is going to fall to third, which is really, really crazy. If you look at what MSC has done, they have purchased 306 container ships, a capacity of 1.2 million TEU since August of 2020. They're doing this because of the demand that was out there, but they're also doing it because they're waiting for their new ships to come online. And so they bought ships at pretty low cost initially, but now what they're going to do is bring these new ships online, much larger vessels that can swing between different trade routes, vessels that are more fuel efficient, so that there was just a report out by BIMCO that they're going to start scrapping more ships. I expect to see those container scrappings happen. We kept talking about them. They haven't materialized yet, but they're about to. And we're going to see it. Matter of fact, you see that with a ship like the Shiling that's heading out to be scrapped from New Zealand. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 3. Story number 3 takes us to the Black Sea grain deal. An extension was announced by President Erdogan of Turkey. Now, President Erdogan is involved in a very contentious election in Turkey, and there was a lot of prospects here for this grain deal to go away. But the announcement came out that it's been extended for 2 more months, and we keep getting these extensions in it. I have a whole video that talks about the implication of this grain deal. So obviously good news regarding the grain deal. However, there are other issues associated with this. This Reuters story, which was the basis of an article or a video I did not too long ago, talks about what is going on with the global supply and why the Black Sea grain deal, while important to Ukraine, may not be so important to the globe. And I disagree entirely with that, because when you create disruptions in global supply, you are if you sit there and say, well, it's not needed right now, well, that can change very quickly. And what you need is redundancy in the global supply chain. And so this assertion to me is very dangerous to make. Going on here, one of the aspects we're seeing about the spillover from Russia-Ukraine obviously has to do with the transfer of oil. And so this story from Reuters over at GCAP, in the US, UK, and others are seeking to target illicit oil transfers at sea. We are seeing more and more of these, where oil coming out of Russia is being transferred to other vessels and then delivered to other places. And this gets into the problem of evading sanctions, and more importantly, the growth of what we call the dark fleet. And so now there's a call about this, especially after the destruction and explosion on board the tanker Pablo that happened off the coast of Malaysia. Even this story from Bloomberg showing that China is ramping up safety checks on old ships as the dark fleet grows. Remember, one of the accusations that came out about the Pablo explosion was that that vessel was not being inspected. It was operating under a Gabon flag. The inert gas system was offline, and that's what caused the explosion to take place. And a lot of tankers that should be heading for the scrapyard are not. Instead, they're finding new reprieves in this tanker fleet. And that leads to Russia's oil being sold in a bigger and bigger market out around the world, with a lot of buyers in Asia right now. And particularly, one of the things we're seeing from West Africa to the Middle East to India, across Asia, is a lot of this oil is being sold there. And I came across this meme, which really sparked my attention right here, is very much focusing on this, with Ukraine, India, and China in this very weird relationship where India is buying grain from Ukraine, but at the same time you got oil that's being shipped to India from Russia. It's just a very complicated arrangement going on. There are so many different players. While Ukraine favors India in terms of trade of grain, they're not enjoying India buying Russian oil, refining it into diesel, and then selling it back to everybody. It's just a crazy relationship. And then you throw this one in where LNG exporters are eyeing new Australia growth as profit boom fades. One of the areas that is competing against the United States in its export of LNG is Australia. Australia has a huge area about this. And what we're seeing is Australia really developing into this. They're talking about investments of over $200 billion. That's over 300 billion Australian dollars over the past 15 years. This is a booming industry for Australia, and Australia is seeing it. Australia, very much like the U.S., is dependent on foreign shipping to move this fuel, however. And so it really finds itself in the position of being an exporter, but without the means to control those exports, which really puts them at a disadvantage. By no means do I make the argument that a country should solely ship its exports. There has to be nations across the board. However, there is an issue when there's almost no play. So you don't have Australian ships or American ships really exporting the LNG. Whereas if you look at Qatar, for example, or Qatar, however you want to pronounce it, they have a huge LNG fleet that is used to ship their LNG around the world. All right, let's go ahead and jump to story number 4. So one of the things I do on a periodic basis is look at my data that comes in on this channel. Where are my viewers? Where are they located? And what I find out is I am not wholly a U.S. viewed audience. I have a global audience. I have people who are all around the world, get up in the morning and have coffee with me, for example, in the Far East, in Southeast Asia, and also a lot of people who watch this in areas beyond where I would think. And one of those that really piqued my interest was New Zealand. New Zealand is a good example. I did the story on the Shiling, got a lot of attention down in New Zealand, and I went kind of down a rabbit hole looking at what's going on in New Zealand. It's like, okay, I'm looking at this ship, the Shiling, that's operating in and around New Zealand, and I wanted to really take a look at this. Last year, I had an opportunity to go up to British Columbia, gave a talk for the Canadian Navy at the Maritime Security Challenges Conference, and got a chance to meet the second in command of the Royal New Zealand Navy. A really impressive Commodore. She was fantastic, gave a great talk. And so really got me interested in New Zealand a lot. And so I went down and found these stories, which I find very interesting. So here's a story from RNZ. This is back in June of 2022. Maersk announces they're starting a dedicated New Zealand coastal service. Story goes on here. One service would link a series of towns around New Zealand, while the other would link another one. These would mean fortnightly connections from Auckland and Nelson, and weekly for others. Mayer said the aim was to offer reliable coastal services and connections for domestic international cargo. Quote, the additional investment into a dedicated New Zealand coastal service in conjunction with recent announcements to build a cold chain facility in Hamilton will create significant value for our New Zealand customers. This is from the statement they said. The new coastal service would be branded at Maersk Coastal Connect as Maersk Coastal Connect. And this goes in conjunction with a big call by New Zealand to have more dedicated service connecting New Zealand ports and cities. Remember, New Zealand has got a population of about 5 million people on two main islands, North Island and South Island, and the way you connect them is by the sea. Well, this is June of 2022. This is the story in March of 2023. Global shipping giant Maersk pulls New Zealand coastal service. They're ending that service. There are concerns at New Zealand's supply chain security after global shipping giant Maersk announced it would pull its national shipping service. Maersk said it would withdraw its dedicated New Zealand coastal service known as Coastal Connect from next month after less than a year in operation. Instead, the company will upgrade its Trans-Tasman Polaris service to a weekly service. But the Maritime Union said the move was a step backwards for New Zealand's supply chain security, with between 36 and 38 staff being made redundant. That is the phrase for basically unemployed. So in the United States, there's a lot of pressure to repeal something called the Jones Act, which protects U.S. coastal trade, and instead go to a system like this where we get foreign shipping companies to come in and provide coastal shipping. And this, to me, is one of the highlight dangers here, is Maersk announced they're going to do it. They come in, and less than a year later, they pull the rug out from New Zealand in this trade because they either did not find it profitable or found better use of their resources. And if they're not generating enough revenue, they have no priority to be here. I add this story with one I saw from CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and another story that was linked on G-Captain by John Conrad. Great Lakes labor, Filipino mariners can now sail on Canadian merchant ships. So the Canadian Merchant Marine now is allowing Filipino merchant mariners, which are the most common merchant mariners in the world out there, to crew their vessels. There was a push for this back in the 1930s in the United States, back when the Philippines was part of the United States. It was a Commonwealth of the United States. But in 1935, the U.S. brokers a treaty to give the Philippines its independence, supposed to be July 4th, 1942. That got delayed because of World War II until July 4th, 1946. But there was a movement to put Filipinos on American merchant ships in the international trade. That was not done for fear that it would look too much like the British and what they did with Indians and Pakistanis and Africans and Carib Islanders. So it never happened. But here you see this happening in the Canadian Merchant Marine. And again, it's a really interesting case study for what nations around the world are doing. New Zealand, which really doesn't have a merchant marine at all, was really dependent on these foreign ships to handle its trade. Now, Maersk is pulling out of that. And now there's going to be difficulty in moving cargo in and around New Zealand. Canada, which is having a lot of problems in building replacement vessels for the Royal Canadian Navy, and enlistments in both the Royal New Zealand Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy are down, and now you're seeing Filipino merchant mariners coming in to crew their vessels. Basically, they're outsourcing the employment on what few vessels they have left. It's a really interesting problem that nations are dealing with. I would argue that in the United States, the merchant marine was the very first basically industry that was outsourced. We outsourced the shipbuilding for the U.S. international fleet. We moved it out in the 70s and 80s over to Korea and Japan. And then in the 90s, we ended the subsidies, the differentials for construction and building of international ships. And what we've seen is the decline of the U.S. maritime base. And we're seeing some countries like New Zealand and Canada where it's almost utterly destroyed. You're also seeing it in places like Australia, for example, South Africa, a lot of other countries around the world that this is happening to. Where you don't see it is in China, for example, or Korea or Japan, where those countries subsidize their shipbuilding and ship operations quite a bit, or countries that create secondary registries like Denmark and Norway. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our last story. So for my last story, I always like to pick a story that I think really sparks some thinking and some conversation on what is going on. I was looking at a whole series of new reports that are coming out. There's a ton of stuff coming out right now. I could do a whole What the Ship on what's come out. So Brent Sadler over at Heritage just produced a report. There's a new report out on port efficiencies. But the one that struck me is I go back to my buddy John Conrad over at G-Captain, who's been really penning a number of stories that are really great. If you're not following G-Captain, you really need to. But John wrote this piece, Naval Diplomacy, the Case for a Maritime G7. So the G7 is currently meeting right now in Hiroshima, Japan. G7 are 7 countries with the largest kind of economic base in the world. And John is making the argument here that there needs to be a maritime, what he calls a maritime G8. And basically start talking about this. And this is not the countries with the largest merchant fleets today. I mean, that would be Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands. And in truth, those are just, at least the Marshall Islands and Liberia, are just the shell corporations in those places. They're headquartered, as I mentioned to you before, in outside of Dulles International Airport in Northern Virginia. But what he is arguing for is bringing together these entities, these organizations, into a maritime G7, G8, whatever it looks at, to bring it together. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the United States and many other countries around the world are sea blind. They don't see the importance of the oceans and ocean shipping. And the argument here is to bring this together and bring that attention, even though the United States, for example, has the 21st largest merchant marine in the world. In terms of ownership, in terms of influence, it has a huge involvement. Same thing with countries like Great Britain, which has a very small merchant marine. I think they're 22nd in the world. But in terms of insurance, for example, Great Britain and London is one of those big sectors. And so you would want to create this M7, M8, whatever John wants to call it here, and start looking at maritime affairs. There's a lot of debate about who should join this. He really doesn't come up here with a good list here, in my opinion, of who should join it, because I think there's a lot of countries that would have a say in this. Should China be in there? Obviously, China has a huge role to play in this. Should they be there? Should Britain and should France and Germany be in it? What other nations do you need to bring into it? Greece, which has the largest ownership in the world, probably needs to be in it. The Philippines, which has the largest crews of vessels out there, along with India and Russia, may need to be out there. Indonesia may need to be in here. Where do you go with this, and how do you move forward for it? And so I think John creates an interesting argument. What are we doing? The old International Maritime Organization model based on nations and everyone representative may not be the best way to do this anymore. Maybe we need something that looks at global trade, those top 20 nations that are connected. Maybe they need to be the forum together. When you look at that liner connectivity between countries, maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need to look along those ways. I think we're seeing a revolution in maritime thought right now. I think people, because of the supply chain crisis, are viewing the ocean in a much different way than we have before. I go back to the idea that in the United States, it's a representative from California and a representative from South Dakota in 2 different political parties who came together to create the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. And, there are a lot of divergent groups today that can be brought together because of the highlight that has been brought forth by the global supply chain and what is happening around the world. We're seeing the potential for peer-to-peer conflict. We're seeing the rising control of the oceans, not as clear-cut as before. Look at Iran grabbing tankers. Look at the United States grabbing tankers. There's a lot going on. There's illegal oil transfers going on out in international waters. How do we fix this? And maybe a maritime G7 is exactly what we need to do that, or at least to raise the issue to the forefront and get this out of the hands of corporations that look at dollars as their bottom line. I'm not saying government is the end-all be-all source, but I can tell you right now, the International Maritime Organization is having lots of issues. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Share this across social media. Hey, if you want to tell someone, hey, I just watched this video. It was great. It's 30 minutes. It's broken into segments so you can watch your different stories. Hey, share it across social media. Let everybody know about what the ship and what's going on with shipping. Give it a thumbs up. That helps us a lot get out and be able to reach other people. And if you want, leave a comment. I love my comments. As long as you're not mean and vindictive and use foul language, I don't ever eliminate a comment. I take criticisms very well. I've been a professor now for over 20 years. Believe me, I take criticism well. I've been married for over 30 years. So you're not going to hurt my feelings. Feel free to leave comments in this spot below. Support the page. How do you support the page? You can hit the super thanks button down below, which allows you to contribute directly to the page, or become a patron. Head on over to Patreon, become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Really helps me put this channel together, especially over the summertime. Got a lot of things coming up over the summer. Interviews with some key people, things I don't get a chance to do during the academic year because I'm busy teaching. But I don't have to do that as long as I have my supporters supporting me, and I don't have to worry about teaching being an adjunct professor, which is a terrible, terrible job. Don't be an adjunct professor. They're really, really low pay. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.